4. You didn't have to tell him, said Harris, who had been permitted to visit Tom the next day in the confinement tent. PM Taylor, stoic and uncorruptible, nodded Harris through noncommittally. Major Sharp had bid it, so of course Matthew Harris may enter and visit the prisoner. We would have been hanged, Matt, she replied, then added, grimacing, do men really do what he said? Some men, nodded Matt. Not most men. They think I am a spy, because of my name. Tom said. Because of my father. Because of my happening to overhear so much about a plot. Harris said nothing immediately, looking Tom up and down. He was still wearing his lower undergarments, betraying his weakness, but instead of the rifle's trousers and jacket, which had been confiscated, he had a shawl round his top half. Tom noticed Harris looking at her form. From Ramona. She was most astonished to be asked to see me. Tom thought back to the woman arriving with a basket of linen as she looked down at the ill-fitting dress. My husband has told me, Ramona had said, looking past Tom, that I needed to see the woman in confinement. Where is she? It took Tom to explain that Harper meant him, rather than a woman expecting to give birth, and, after an initial start, told her to take the blanket and she would bring a dress the next day. You still have a cut on your head, said Harris. And I would dearly love to bathe, Tom replied. He looked up, his eyes resting on Harris's face. I am just so very sorry to have disgraced to Captain, she continued, feeling tears prick behind her eyes. For I know I will be turned out of the 60th for this, and the army is all I know. That afternoon, eschewing his own rest time, Matt Harris brought Tom his own washing water and some leaves from the same tree that he had seen Tom take the day before. You will look most becoming in a dress, Tom, he remarked, and left Tom to his ablutions. 8,888,888. She was one of yours, Fredrickson, what say you? They had both had time to think on the day's events, ones which had begun depressively, heading towards the distasteful but necessary direction of capital punishment, and finishing in shock that they had a Polly Perks in their midst. Fredrickson looked at the back of the retreating figure, being led as it was towards the confinement tent, guarded as it was at all times, that acted like a temporary prison cell. He turned to look at Sharp's grim face. I gained a lot of my men from the 52nd, Fredrickson began. I believe she was one of them. But Sharp held up a hand. I'm not blaming you, William, who could tell? She was a good marksman, good on the ground, the captain remarked. Fast lithe. Not called lucky for nothing. Tom. He settled on, has fought almost from the day we began in Portugal. Good grief, she must have been no more than a child, exclaimed the major. What must she be now, 20? 18. Not many choices for an orphan, destitute girl, I suppose, Fredrickson mused. Richard Sharp took in the captain's expression. He had begun life in a brothel. It was true that almost any other choice of employment was preferable. I must say, you are taking this all rather easily, William. Her father withheld provisions to Boston while you were under siege, supplied the revolutionaries, sent gold out of His Majesty's treasury intended for army payback across the Atlantic for the cause of Irish Home Rule. Yes. This is true, agreed Fredrickson. Bloody woman, no case in the army for a woman. But I can understand why she took the king's shilling, Richard, like so many orphans do. She has never to my knowledge deserted, or ever been derelict in her duty. It should be remembered he looked out over the dry ground to the confinement tent. We should not desert the child. Aye, nodded Sharp. But all the same, a young girl, daughter of the biggest traitor since John Paul Jones, a senior officer who set out to deliberately lose us the colonies? He marched over to the tent, opening himself now, as if expecting Tom Wright to have broken loose and was in the process of absconding. Don't you think it is at all strange that a young girl has hidden for years in the army without being discovered, and has stayed lucky for so long? She must have had help. You think she is a spy, you mean? Involved in the business with the Catalonians? Fredrickson frowned, his eye patch crinkling. In return for cuckooing in the army nest for years, Sharp nodded, as if he had hit upon something. Aye. Years. With the opportunity to spy for the French in return for being left alone, unattacked, uninjured on the field. Well, Richard, she can't have been that good. Fredrickson held up the green rifle's jacket that had once belonged to Thomas Wright. Eh? We are winning, aren't we? Wellington is on the verge of breaking over the border. Sharp thought about this. Was she actually a spy, one in league with Ducot and the Catalonians? Why would she mention his name? Yet, she was fastidious about her uniforms, even to the point of keeping the red, 52nd Oxford's one. And if she was a spy, wouldn't the French have had a better handle on her? In which case, she was a damn good soldier. Ha, a woman, a damn good soldier? Sharp thought again. He would never believe that. But of course, he had known a woman like that, the only woman he had ever loved. He would tell Antonia about Teresa, her mother, when she was grown. She will stay with Ramona, with the women, nodded Sharp. We will not have her leave. Very good, Major, nodded Fredrickson, and took his leave. No, thought Sharp. For if she is gone, however will we find out who is right, me or sweet William? How will we ever find out if she was a traitor like her father, or simply a poor, misguided girl working for pay? Besides, he had nearly worked out this puzzle to do with the Catalonians, and it would not do to lose one of the pieces. 88,888,888. William Fredrickson had told Sharp he would take the news to the former Tom Wright, that they were moving camp 20 miles north, and she was permitted to remain with the camp, with the women, and must not attempt to rejoin the 60th. All this was in his mind when he touched Tom Wright's shoulder, clothed now in a cotton chintz, still wrapped in the dark, brown woolen blanket. But, she was not asleep. Miss Haycock, Fredrickson said, taking his hand from her arm as if she were fire. Again, I disturb you in prayer? Tom opened his eyes. Sir, she whispered, and stood up. I am also sorry too, sir. Tom had hoped that the captain would come. It had never been her intention to bring shame to him, and she told him so. 'Tis nothing but a minor inconvenience. I am to be one man short when we go into battle tomorrow, or the next day. He waved his hand away, emphatically, then continued, before Tom had the chance to offer to fill her old place with herself. Major Sharp has decided that you are to remain in camp, as a vulnerable young woman with no family. Tom was staring at him wide-eyed, his macabre features moving as he spoke. But, she began, her brain racing. However, the captain continued to talk, brusquely and curtly. You are to go with the women, you will abide there. You will work as one of them, with the jobs that are needed, yes? Yes. But, the information was coming fast, and her mind was agreeing to it all. But the overriding feeling that she had was to tell the captain that she was sorry that she was related to such a man who had caused such widespread destruction and devastation. Do we have an accord, Miss Haycock? This time? He waited for her to speak. Yes, sir, she nodded, and was astonished that he saluted. Automatically, so did Tom. Your shilling, said Fredrickson, holding it out. A symbol of our agreement. You shall not attempt to rejoin the army. Carefully, Tom took it, looking at its obverse, and for the tiny scratches near King George's ringlets. Yes, sir, she nodded. But the captain strode away, pushing the canvas out of his way as he went. 88,888,888. They had moved to Almudiva, north of the brook and the river that fed it. She had spent the night alone under a canvas next to the one Sergeant Harper and his wife and child slept. Reducing the camp to baggage trains was something Tom had become used to in 6 years, and it was to her shock, and then embarrassment, that she was chided by Rossler for taking her usual role with the 60th. Harris had given her a sympathetic look as she slunk away and had himself been chided for slacking, so Tom decided to wait by the mules until the camp was on the move, feeling the same consternation when Major Sharp called a halt at the bottom of a low, wide ridge, whence the reassembly of camp took place. The men had orders to march the next morning, so spent the evening preparing for their march. Rifles were stripped down and cleaned, uniforms were washed and neatened. Food was eaten, heartily, and with a good quantity of beer. Tom cooked, and took in several uniforms of the 95 THs, Harris's included, but none of her old company came near her. She wasn't exactly shunned, so much as an invisible dividing line had been drawn. Lucky Tom was no more. She was a camp follower now, and did women's things, work with them. How long it would last, Tom was not sure, but she had given her word to the captain on her shilling that she would do this work and not fight as a soldier. 3 skirmishes, a few wounded and soldiers to tend, that had been the next fortnight, and Tom soon found that, in a second-hand dress, she had more or less become invisible. And invisibility brought the advantage of guards being dropped and tongues freer than they ought to be. Tom soon found out that the soldiers believed the 2 rifle companies would soon be joining a foot and horse cavalry still further north to drive the French from a fort on the northern frontier of Catalonia. Additionally, they would be needed to snipe and cover, before the dragoons came into play with cannon. Bagot, who had wounded her head, when she had been tied to the tree, the blow which had left a scarred lump on the left of her temple, had said in her hearing that once the fort was cleared, then the last of the French would be gone and there would be a great push to the border. And, all the while she was in camp, cooking, washing, nursing, Tom realized that she had not heard any more voices at night, or shouts, or gunfire. Whatever that had been must have been over. Until that night. That night, the dreaded pain returned and she hauled herself out of her blanket knowing that blood was absorbing into her clothes. Ramona had given her rags for the purpose, so she quickly bound one inside her petticoat, one problem solved, and tried to go back to sleep despite the horrible seizing of her muscles. The worse that they are, Ramona had told Tom, in her brief, but eye-opening lesson, the easier childbirth will be, for it is the same muscle that eases out the baby. Tom had scoffed on her head at the thought of childbirth, and wished Ramona would have said instead what would help to be rid of the pain. Alcohol, probably. But there was little chance of that. Walking helped, just pacing around. So Tom slipped on her underbreeches and wrapped the shawl around herself, stepping into her boots as she began to tread away from the 95 TH's camp and towards the trees. And then she saw them, the rifles, both the 60th and the 95th assembling to march north, she reckoned, by their direction, to meet a larger company and provide cover. She would never know, and the pang of sadness that she would not be going with them made her feel as if her heart were being rushed. To work, then, she thought, despite the darkness? To washing, to mending. Yes, she could do some mending. Blankets were always in need of blanket stitch edging, and some the cotton sheets of the officers had holes that needed darning. Tom wished she hadn't turned back to watch the column ebb away from the camp. To her left shoulder Ramona would have said, in her eminently sensible manner, "It is so that we will miss them. They will be back, and it is our job to be ready for our men." But there was no man Tom was preparing to welcome, not a lover, like the Spanish woman meant. Pain again coursed through her lower stomach. In the full Tom sat, needle in hand, working lap. This would take her mind off going with the rifles. This would take her mind off the pain in her stomach. The moon was high when Tom finished the last stitch. She got up, stretching her legs out. It was no use. This woman's fertility bleeding was still painful and exhausting. But then the thought occurred to Tom that there was no one to tell her not to bathe. Returning the mended washing to the stores, Tom slipped past the annex of her tent and beyond. The water flow was stronger here, and Tom knew that she needed to make sure she didn't go in too deeply, otherwise the current might sweep her away. And it was glorious. To strip off and be free, under the cover of darkness. To be clean and fresh. It was heavenly. Just as Tom was redressing a crack of a twig and dropped, the young Spanish woman slumped down and began to crawl away. Powder, bullet, ramrod, fire. This time her aim was true, and the man flopped down. Another, this time freeing two women who were being pulled by one of the officers who had left his horse to claim what he clearly thought was his. Down he went, and Tom got two more men cleanly in the back. She had to move now, for her position was beginning to attract attention. Sweeping under the edge of the tent canvas, she made swift ground to behind the back of Ramona's tent. Mrs. Harper was protesting insistently, and the baby was crying. Ramona was holding him to her chest, refusing to go with the man. He lashed out and hit her in the face, and she fell. This gave Tom a clear shot at the man, who was bearing down on her. But before she could reload, a voice shouted, "Colonel Marliott," and then a lot of words in French. She turned to the voice, crouching on as a shot whistled past her head. The man, Marliott, who had been harassing Ramona, looked in her direction. Tom slunk lower and crept as silently as she could in under breeches and addressed towards the tents of Mrs. Anson and Mrs. Paget. Neither women were harmed, but both were shaken. Kitty Anson turned in horror as Tom stepped out of the shadows, but stood still and quiet when she realized it was Tom. "There's a cave towards the top of the river. Collect what you can," Tom instructed. "Food, blankets, tell the women to get there and stay there till someone comes for you. You will be safe there." Kitty nodded, as Charlotte Paget bent immediately to the task. Then, an almighty scream issued from the top of the camp. Schmidt's woman was being dragged to the ground, the child she had with her pulled out of her arms. In the moonlight Tom could just about see the officer still on horseback jump down beside the man who was now attempting to defile Anna Schmidt, raising up the bayonet and strike it down into the child. Anna screamed again, but had a hand clamped over her mouth as the man continued his vile attack. Tom felt hot rage well up in him, but it gave way to cool logic as she quickly assessed the situation. Then, powder ball ramrod. Once, twice, 3 times, and 3 more assailants were dead. In the carnage, however, the word had clearly begun to spread as the women were not standing in mute terror, or attempting to abscond, but were at meaningful tasks. Tom saw blankets, she saw bread, he saw children wrapped close to bodies. Good. They had listened to her. She moved to another position, this time nearer to the stores. At the same time, fire and destruction of the domestic tents was being carried out. Tom counted to see how many of the men were left. 2 were raiding the stores. 1 was destroying a tent nearby, presumably in search of an occupant. The officer on horseback made 4. She reloaded and took aim at the officer. Him gone would hopefully mean disarray for those under him. A shout went up, presumably to alert someone that an assailant was hidden, and Tom narrowly missed another bullet, this one lodging in the tree by his leg. She dashed forward, only to be confronted by another officer on horseback. Now she came to think of it, there had been 2. He raised his sword to strike it down on her, but Tom was too quick for him. Turning her rifle, she held it with the butt end and swung it around, striking the horse in the mouth. At once, the animal reared, crushing the cart with its hind legs, throwing its rider, who was projected back several feet, landing on the now silent body of Anna Schmidt. Tom surged forward, seizing the man's own weapon, a French officer's cavalry blade, striking it straight into his stomach. A round whistled by her ear again, but it has missed, and she ducked down again. The other officer, French, Spanish words, despite British Army red jackets, they were retreating. Seizing the sword of the dead officer, she found the horse that she had struck, pressing her hand gently to its cheek in the way she had often seen Matthew Harris do when breaking in yearlings. It calmed, and Tom leapt towards it, managing to mount it, tearing up her dress from the skirt to accommodate her legs. Whatever the reason for retreat, the three remaining men and the one mounted officer were retreating, not fleeing in terror, Tom realized, but going, as if their objective had been achieved. She rode on, following them as, in the moonlight, she saw a ribbon of figures moving slowly towards the riverbank. Words, French, Spanish, Tom did not know, were being shouted angrily between the attackers. The three men on foot had gestured to the French officer, before splashing through the river, the huffs and snorts of horses, presumably tied on the opposite bank, filtered through to Tom. She moved closer, and was almost at the position she had been when they rode into camp. Just get the angle right, thought Tom, and she would get the bastard that had raped and murdered Anna. But it was impossible. They were too far away and the angle was too steep. Their heads kept showing themselves around a rock, dodging back and forth in view. Were she to miss, the bullet may ricochet right back to her. Tom edged forward, and she could see that the three men had mounted their horses. But they did not ride off immediately. French, Spanish were relayed between them, and it seemed to Tom that one of the men was the interpreter between the languages. Then, they were still, the horses braced to ride. Damn. Tom cursed at her failure to shoot these invaders, and made to ride back, to see if any women remained, or what could be done about the camp. But, the French and Spanish speakers suddenly began arguing again, and, from the admixture one word sprang from the mixture, one name. One she had heard before. Driving on the horse around and galloping in the opposite direction of the camp, Tom followed that one name. Ducos.